everyone, welcome to part 3 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sewalong. Today I'll be showing you how to assemble the back of the dress, and we'll also be sewing our shoulder seams. Let's get started. Okay, we'll start with the inner waistband. Grab one of your waistband pattern pieces and sew along one long edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This will be our guide for pressing. Press the long edge of the waistband towards the wrong side on the stitch line. Now, find the center of the back bodice and the center of the inner waistband and pin them at that point. You will want the right side of the waistband facing the wrong side of the bodice. Align the rest of the waistband with the back bodice and pin well. Now, sew the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance with a long stitch length. This is what we call basting. Grab the other waistband pattern piece and align it to the back bodice, but this time the right side of the waistband should be facing the right side of the bodice. We're effectively sandwiching the bodice between the two waistbands. Sew the outer waistband to the bodice with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a normal stitch length. You'll notice that I didn't pin the waistband onto the bodice this time. I found that after the inner waistband is basted on, pins aren't really needed to sew this seam. Now we'll sew 2 lines of basting stitches on the back skirt. Be sure to pull long thread tails before you start sewing and increase your stitch length to the longest length possible. Starting at the marked dots, sew 1 basting stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and leave long thread tails at the end. Then sew another basting stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving long tails again. Now, pull the 2 bobbin threads of your basting stitches from one side towards the middle of the skirt, and repeat from the opposite side until it looks like the top of the back of the skirt will be roughly the same width as the waistband. Pin the skirt to the outer waistband with right sides together, matching the center notches and distributing your fabric gathers evenly along the entire seam. Pin this seam really well. Sew the skirt to the waistband with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a normal stitch length. I like to sew the seam with the gathers facing me so that I can adjust them as I sew if needed. Okay, now you can remove your basting stitches from the skirt. You can just gently pull on one bobbin thread and it should slide out pretty easily. Press the inner waistband down and press the seam allowance of the outer waistband up. I recommend you turn the back of the dress over with the right side facing you and press these seams really well. Now, pin the bottom of the inner waistband down so that the fold of the fabric extends just barely beyond that seam line. You can kind of see how nicely this encloses that seam. I put a lot of pins in this seam to make sure that the fabric doesn't shift while I'm sewing. Okay, take this over to your sewing machine and edge stitch the bottom of the waistband with a 1/8 inch seam allowance on the right side of the waistband. You'll notice I'm removing the pins from the wrong side of the waistband as I sew, and I'm using my fingers to make sure the seams stay aligned. Now you'll also edge stitch the top of the waistband with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So we've just made a channel for a waistband elastic. To insert the elastic, place a safety pin at one short end and feed the elastic through the channel, pulling the safety pin forward and then shifting the fabric back over it. If you're new to sewing, this takes a bit of time, so just be patient. We'll use a pin at each side seam to secure the elastic for now. You can use a long straight stitch to baste it down, but I prefer to layer the tabs and the waist ties on and just baste everything at once. For this next part, I recommend you follow the instructions and illustrations on steps 16 and 17 closely. And I apologize, the video showing me placing the tabs and the ties on the bodice did not record, but you can see here what I've done and I will walk you through it. With the right side of the dress back facing you, place the short tie on top of the waistband on the left side of the bodice. And then place the long tie on the waistband on the right side, like left and right side. Then place one button tab, it doesn't matter which one, on top of the short tie on the left side of the bodice and pin all of these layers together, making sure that they're well aligned. Now place the other button tab on the wrong side of the bodice on the other side of the dress. You can't see it here because it's underneath the dress back, but on the right side, as we're talking about left and right of the dress, the tab and tie will sandwich the waistband. If you get confused, check out those illustrations in the instructions. They should help a lot. Now, baste all of these layers together at the side seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that everything stays well aligned as you sew. This is a pretty thick seam, so go slow. Okay, the final step in part 3 of the sew along will be sewing the shoulder seams, which is actually pretty straightforward. Align the dress back and one bodice right sides together at the shoulder seam and pin. Just repeat that for the opposite shoulder seam. And sew these seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And finish those seams as you desire. That's all for part 3 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sew Along. In part 4, we'll be sewing the facings from start to finish.